So, hi everybody, welcome to November's Tenant Talk Live. This month we'll be talking about organizing as just disaster recovery. And for folks who are new, just reintroducing myself, my name is Sid Betancourt and I use she, they pronouns, and I am a project manager at the Coalition for Inclusive Community Engagement. And again, for folks who might need a refresher, you're currently joining Tenant Talk Live, where we provide opportunities for folks to connect with NLIHC and one another and share best practices for, tenant organizing, but also how to get involved in federal housing advocacy and leading within your communities. And for folks who might not be aware, this meeting is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. So just keep that in mind in case you want to ask any questions live or want to share any information in the chat. We do have two amazing guests joining us today. I might be a little biased because they're my colleagues, but before I pass it over to them, I do want to go over just like a few reminders that we always go over at the beginning of these calls. And the first one being is our community agreements that we put together at the beginning of this year. We're actually going to be doing it again pretty soon, so start thinking about any changes you want to make or anything else. But the first one is our platinum rule here, which is treat others the way they want to be treated. Or in other words, just please consider how someone might want to be treated and how that might differ how you want to be treated. Muting our mics except when we're speaking, listening with an open mind and empathy, and making sure that as we take up space that we also give space to others. And also folks thought it was important to remember that this is being recorded, so I'll just say that one more time. And if y'all have any feedback, again, the beginning of the year isn't the only time you can contribute to those, so feel free to email me with any feedback that you have for those community agreements. All right, and then I did see a question in the chat, but I'll circle back to it in a second. And then if you all are registered or signed up for NLIHC emails, you should be receiving an email this Friday called The Connection. And this one is going to contain like all of the recap materials from this call today, including the recording, the chat, any links that we shared in the chat. And again, just keep an eye out for that connection email. Some of you have opted out of those emails, which is perfectly fine. But in case you're unsure if you're signed up for them or not, I'll drop the link in the chat there so you can sign up for those. And then we have extended the deadline for our Tenant Talk Live like feedback survey. So if you wanted to give us any input on any of like the sessions that we did this year, just want to give us feedback more generally about these calls, feel free to participate in that survey. And then I think that's it for my updates. But again, just some logistics. Please make sure if you have any questions throughout the call to drop them in the chat. And if you prefer to ask your question out loud, we'll also have time at the end for you to come off mute. And just to make sure that you stay muted if you're not speaking. And then I think somebody did ask a question about the forum in March. If you just want to email me separately, CJ, and I can connect you to the folks that can help you out with that. But with that, I'll introduce you to today's guest. So today we have NLIHC's very own Noah Patton and Megan. I am so sorry you're going to tell me your last name.
Meghan Mertyris.
Mertyris, thank you so much. And they'll be joining us today for this really, really important and I think timely discussion, but it's always timely if I'm being honest. And for folks who are still kind of learning some of the staff here at NLIHC. Noah has been around for a few years and he is NLIHC's manager of disaster recovery. And prior to working at NLIHC, he used to work at Homeless Persons Representation Project Incorporated, and he would help advocate for policies to expand public benefit programs and protecting voucher holders. And he's also done a lot of cool stuff. He's a lawyer, great person. And then we have Meghan too, who just recently joined us this year as a discovery disaster housing recovery analyst. But she also works really closely with Noah on our disaster housing recovery coalition, which I will drop the link to that in the chat so you all can learn more about that. But just helping out with all of like the communications, the outreach, the advocacy. And prior to that, she actually worked at the New Jersey Organizing Project and the New Jersey Resource Project, where she actually got to do a lot of organizing and mobilization on that Hurricane Ida. Awesome. And I'll pass it over to the both of y'all, and I'll drop a link again to the DHRC in the chat for folks to look at. And again, just a reminder, folks, to stay muted unless you're speaking. But thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Sid. How's it going, everybody? I figured we'd replace our election anxiety with some well-founded climate change-based anxiety, just for the next, hour or so. So thank you for indulging me in that. But yeah, my name's Noah Patton, manager of disaster recovery here at the coalition. I think we were hoping to get somebody from out in Western North Carolina, but I don't see them on right now. So if they're under a different name, you just shout me out right now. But seeing none, we'll let them talk when they hop on. And I will go into my little presentation right here. So let me share my screen and figure out how to do that. Cool. And boop. Are you guys seeing a disaster housing recovery coalition slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. Cool. So I'm just going to give a general overview of disaster recovery, and honestly, I'm more interested in the conversation here around how you see, all of this information intersecting with your work and how to kind of build off of it. I think, for a long time we've been in a very proactive, or we've been in a very reactive mode. So, it's like disasters happen, we respond to it. Another disaster, we respond to it. But I think with the addition of Meghan and a 100% increase in the amount of capacity we have to do disaster work here at the coalition, I think we're thinking a little bit more proactive and how to kind of talk about disaster risk, how to kind of work it all into what everybody on this call is doing and what all the other teams at NLIHC are up to. So with that, here's some general disaster information, just so y'all know. So the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, it's a group of over 900 local, state, and national orgs working to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover. So we offer federal advocacy, obviously, a lot of information sharing about what's going on with disasters, what has happened in different areas, a little bit of technical assistance, which I guess is kind of the same as information sharing, but a bit more like, what do you do in a specific disaster recovery context, or like, how do you navigate a specific problem, as well as advocacy support. So, because usually after a disaster, the last thing you want to do is watch a congressional committee hearing. So we can take one for the team on that. Cool. So just starting off, I think it's important to say, what is a disaster? And actually, it's interesting. We don't really have a consensus definition of what a disaster actually is, which I always seems interesting. But suffice to say, a disaster is what happens when a hazard, which is like wind, rain, or Godzilla, meets the built environment where we live and work and generally go about our lives, and causes conditions that overwhelm the community's ability to effectively withstand and respond to that hazard. So with that definition, it's important to note that, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. because that definition requires us to be part of it, right? So it's like our societal issues are what determines a disaster. Think of it like a hurricane in the middle of the ocean is not a disaster because it is not impacting us. I mean, it might be a disaster for fish, but it's not a disaster for human beings. What makes it a disaster is where we place our homes and where we live and how well we build our homes or build our response capabilities and that sort of thing. That's what determines what a disaster is. So I don't like to call things natural disasters because I feel like it lets policymakers off the hook. And kind of makes it sound like it's like an unavoidable thing when it actually is pretty avoidable. Disasters are fully avoidable. It's just, the policymakers that be don't want to avoid them, or like the avoiding them would be too expensive or difficult. So, um, it's also important to note that sometimes a disaster might exist, but nobody might call it a disaster. That was happening a lot of times with like heat waves and that sort of thing, where it was a disaster, but nobody really called it a disaster, despite the fact that it was, overwhelming our ability to respond to it. So, uh, it's also important to note that, I think you hear a lot of like, oh, disasters aren't political, right? But disasters are super political. They might not be partisan. A hurricane doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, but like, we're living in a political society. So, when society gets impacted, it's political. And so what is a disaster survivor? I've had a couple conversations sometimes where folks might not have realized that they were disaster survivors. If you can believe it, it's, more than 20 million households experience disasters each year. That number is just going to be growing. Um, I think sometimes we think of a disaster survivor as like somebody that lost their home or like had to move because of, flooding in their unit or something like that. But, you know, even if you, even if your home and your stuff are fine after a disaster, like you survived it, you experienced it, and you were affected by it. And so, I think it's important to call that out, that there's not like a level of damage necessary to make you a disaster survivor or not. And I think what comes with being a disaster survivor is the experience and the experiencing it, and then being experienced in navigating the disaster. And that's a very important and valuable thing, and something that I think we need to better integrate into how we do disaster recovery, right? Is like relying on the expertise and experiences of disaster impacted communities and disaster impacted people. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about like disasters and housing. I feel like this is all pretty kind of like intuitive, it might be a bit obvious, but indulge me for a little bit here. Um, so what happens to housing after disasters is that you have housing, oftentimes rental housing, because rental housing is kind of located in more disaster prone areas. You have rental units getting damaged, getting destroyed.
Find who was there we go. Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. Uh, uh, yeah, so you have portions of the rental housing stock that gets damaged during disaster. And then you have people that own their own homes, their homes getting damaged or destroyed during the disaster. So what happens is simultaneously, people with the destroyed homes need other homes. And the people that own their own homes need rental housing to live in while they repair their home or find new homes. So all of that increases the demand for rental housing after a disaster. At the same time, you're creating greater inaccessibility because you're removing rental housing from the market, right? So that means higher rents due to price gouging by landlords, taking advantage of the situation. It's even less likely if I'm living with a physical disability, or I have a mobility impairment and I need a specific unit that would allow me to access it and exit and enter and so on and so forth. So that's decreases my ability to find that unit. And then it also like creates issues with if I'm coming into the area to like rebuild a bridge or something like that, that means I can't find rental housing, which makes it slower to recover from the disaster. Now, as a result, what we see is there's a displacement of the population. People got to go other places to get the housing. And then there's an increase in people experiencing homelessness in the impacted areas. So HUD does that point in time count of homeless population, folks experiencing homelessness in cities across the country, and we've looked at the surveys before and after disasters, and there's always an increase post-disaster in people experiencing homelessness. And so I kind of alluded to this before, but it's the risk, what we call the likelihood that a unit might be impacted by a disaster, is based around the location of the housing. Affordable housing, we've seen through some analysis that NLIHC has done, is that affordable housing is more likely to be located in areas of greater risk of disaster damage than non-affordable housing. Uh, Around 450,000 federally subsidized units are in flood-prone areas. And affordable housing is more likely to exist in like the peripheral, like the edges of a community, um, that are more likely to experience disaster damage. At the same time, there's also been a pattern of unequal patterns of infrastructure maintenance and investment, which also means that areas with lower income, like lower income communities, typically have like less updated infrastructure, like floodwaters and floodwater management systems and things like that, which means that they're more likely to experience those negative outcomes there because of that unequal pattern of investment. And at the same time, as I'm sure many on this call also, note, I think it's often talked about in terms of redlining and that sort of thing. But there's a lack of access to services, financing, food, emergency services, a reliance on public transit that sometimes can't operate after a disaster. There's a poor relationship with law enforcement officers, rightfully so, and other government agencies. And there's also a lot of communication gaps during disaster situations that can very quickly turn deadly. So one example is Sandpiper Cove, which was an apartment complex out in Galveston. Um, so in late August of 2020, Hurricane Laura was looking like it was going to impact the Texas coast. It actually ended up curving off and impacting southeast Louisiana, no, southwest Louisiana um, instead, but Galveston was evacuated. And as folks in this apartment complex experienced, it was a very chaotic experience. The management office had closed several days before in advance of the hurricane. They basically had maintenance folks passing out half slips of paper that were had advice on like how to evacuate, but it was also kind of for the company. It was like advice provided to the company, so it made it even more confusing. Um, there wasn't a uniform effort to like let folks know where to go for the evacuation, what to bring with you, what, that you need to bring medication and that sort of thing. Um, and folks that kind of had arrived earlier in the day to the evacuation center, it was 5 to 6 hours in the heat waiting for buses. Um, the community center that was the meetup point was not unlocked. So there was no bathrooms there and that sort of thing. And actually, multiple people ended up having to just deciding in all the chaos that they were just going to stay behind. Where if the hurricane had actually hit Galveston, it was very, very likely that those folks would have lost their lives. Um, and basically throughout all this, this is a report by Texas Housers, and they actually had an organizer on the ground, kind of like looking at all this as it was happening and trying to help out. But it was basically pandemonium, and I think it's a good example of like how not to do it, and I think it's a good example of, I think we all see, you know, experienced and saw the chaotic response to Hurricane Katrina and that kind of evacuation, and you have to assume that it got a little bit better. And I think broadly it has by, baby steps, but very often I think this is an example of like who gets left behind in terms of planning. And who are the authorities thinking of when they create evacuation plans? And very, very often it is not uh, folks with low incomes, and it's not renters, and it's not folks living with disabilities, that's for sure. So I'll say, kind of looking at how disasters go, right? This isn't going to be this detail. I'm not going to like read all this because it's a little bit too much information for 6 p.m. at night. Uh, so I'll say, let's say a disaster happens, right? And who's steering the response? Where do we put shelters? Like, who's running that? How's that working? So in this country, uh, that immediate kind of disaster response is governed by your local emergency managers. It'll typically be something like your Office of Emergency Management Agency. Um, and most of the time it's kind of they're like co-located with the fire department, but sometimes they're co-located with the cops, and so it gets a little hairy sometimes. But um, those are the folks that are kind of guiding the initial response, even from FEMA. Like FEMA has to like pay attention to these folks at the local level, which if you're an organizer and kind of looking into disaster stuff, like those are kind of the folks that you want to hit up ahead of the disaster and just kind of make contact with and get somebody's cell phone number out in that office. And so the initial response is kind of along these things they call community lifelines. And here at NLIHC, we're of course focused on that second one there, food, water, and shelter. Uh, and oftentimes that's handled by groups like the Red Cross, what they call VOADs, or volunteer organizations active on disasters. So, the shelter itself might not be, run directly by your local government, but it'll be like, a Red Cross setup. But the local government will kind of direct the Red Cross on where to set it up. Um, so if a disaster is declared, FEMA will provide like operational support to the local folks, and that'll be like communications, supplies, that sort of thing. So I just go into this level of detail because sometimes you're like, where's FEMA? Like, and you're like, well, FEMA doesn't actually, for better or for worse, FEMA doesn't control the immediate disaster response. They're kind of just there to help facilitate resource sharing and that sort of thing. Um, Helps to know who to get mad at, I've found. Uh, and so some equity issues in emergency response, of course, is, lack of access to emergency information. There's no means of evacuation or lack of control over the destination. Like I said, like that example that I gave, like those folks, they got on those buses. They didn't, you didn't get to choose like, oh, take me to, I have family in, Dallas, take me there. I got family in Houston, take me there. Like, no, they just got put on a bus and taken somewhere. Um, and that's very disconcerting and actually prevents a lot of folks from sometimes utilizing that service because you don't know where you're going to end up. Um, there's discrimination and lack of care for specific needs at emergency shelters. Like at during Hurricane Michael in Florida, they actually like made folks that had been experiencing homelessness at the time of the disaster wear specific like stickers on their sleeves that would identify them as folks experiencing homelessness. So like people could keep an extra eye on them or something. And of course, that's like exceptionally discriminatory. There's also a disruption of support networks. Obviously, police and the Department of Homeland Security plays an active role which also brings in some immigration issues. We saw a little bit of immigration issues already out in Western North Carolina with like ICE handing out water bottles in immigrant communities, which of course scared the ever-loving crap out of everybody in that community, as it would me, as well as curfews. Um, and curfews gets a little weird because there's been a lot of studies on this issue, and historically there's not a lot of looting after disasters in America. There's like kind of sometimes there might be, but most often it's just like folks that are like, I do not have food and the grocery store is closed. This is the only grocery store I have access to, so I'm gonna bust the window and take some food out. That's not really looting. It's kind of more like surviving. And so, despite that fact, I've found a trend, I guess, amongst law enforcement professionals to really want to get out there and be all macho and institute curfews after certain times. And of course, that just impacts folks that desperately need help a lot more. After the East Kentucky floods, there was something in like Breathitt County. Breathitt County? Yeah, yeah. Where they just towed everybody's car that got like flooded out and then charged disaster survivors $200 to access their flooded out cars that they put in the impound lot. Uh, so of course that's always a big thing. I'm gonna pause there just because oh, Megan, you're running the chat. Cool. God bless you. Um, Looking at like short-term recovery, which is kind of immediately after the, emergency response phase, you start short-term recovery, and that's kind of like picking up the pieces, I like to call it. At the federal level, that's often run by FEMA. And basically, the aid program that we're looking at most for FEMA is individual assistance. There is a thing called FEMA public assistance, but that's assistance for governments and eligible nonprofits. So what we want is individual assistance, which provides assistance to households. And if that sounds very confusing, that's because it is. But suffice to say, there's a lot of different types of assistance available. I know we've heard a lot about the $750 for emergency needs. Um, you know, I sometimes I get a little like miffed that we're only ever talking about the $750 because the FEMA cap on assistance is like $45,000. And so just fighting over the 750 always, I'm like, well, no, but you could get 18 months of rental assistance from FEMA. But it's difficult to get, and that's the problem. So always trying to kind of extend that out there. But suffice to say that there's a lot of different options for assistance, but also suffice to say that it is exceptionally difficult to access FEMA assistance. Historically, there's a question on the FEMA application that asks whether you would be willing to relocate, um, whether you'd be willing to relocate after this disaster you just experienced. And most of the time, folks say, or, instinctually, if you wanted to stay in your house, you'd say, no, I want to stay. I don't want to relocate. Um, what that question is actually asking is, would you like to temporarily relocate while your house is repaired? And so when people say, oh, no, I don't want to relocate, then FEMA says, oh, well, then your house must be fine. And so we won't give you rental assistance. And so, I mean, and it's worded like that on the application on purpose to confuse people. So you give the wrong answer and then FEMA doesn't have to give you any assistance. And so, that's just one example of a wide variety of pitfalls in attempting to fill out this application. Um, FEMA utilizes what do we call it? Categorical ineligibility, which is FEMA assumes that every single disaster survivor that shows up and applies for assistance is ineligible for the assistance until that disaster survivor can prove that they are actually eligible. And what we do at the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, what we're pushing for is to flip that so that any person that shows up to a FEMA disaster recovery center is presumed to be eligible for assistance until FEMA proves, FEMA realizes otherwise. And one way to get at that would be, and this is what I'm always yelling and screaming about is like, if you're on TANF or if you're on food, if you're getting SNAP benefits, if you're utilizing a housing choice voucher, like, why do you need to do an income eligibility application for FEMA? Like, you should just get, you know, rental assistance already. Like, they should just ask you, is your house okay? If not, okay, here's alternative rental assistance or something like that. So people don't have to fill out the big old application and go through all of that. But anyways, um, oh, I did want to note just for public housing folks. Um, so the big thing that I've seen for residents of public housing is sometimes PHAs like to utilize a disaster as a way to kick people out, like convert people over to housing choice vouchers if they're in a full public housing building. So it is very important to, like, the minute you get cell phone service, wherever you're at post-disaster, is calling that PHA and saying, no, no, I want that unit. I'm still staying in the unit, to make sure that they don't just like bump you for abandoning the unit or whatever. But public housing authorities, there is a emergency work fund at HUD. There's not a ton of money in there, but PHAs can immediately start repair work. But most of the time, if a building gets substantially damaged in a disaster, the PHA is just going to either offer you an alternative unit at a different public housing building or just give you a housing choice voucher. Um, and so yeah, folks should take note that sometimes that option is like super far away. I mean, I know from Ida, it was like, you know, people getting offered, people from like the New York metro area getting offered, a room in Atlantic City or something like that. And they're like, well, no, my doctor's here. Like, my kids go to school here. I'm not going to move to Atlantic City randomly. Um, so this is kind of what I was just ranting about. Um, there's a lot of short-term housing solutions that are very slow to deploy, like talking about those FEMA trailers that we hear so much about. Those are really slow to deploy because FEMA has to like build the infrastructure necessary to put all those homes out somewhere, and that takes a very long time. Um, yeah, and suffice to say, I'll also say that so FEMA has a statutory limit of 18 months on disaster assistance. So at 18 months after the disaster, the assistance gets shut off. Um, and that means like even if you were appealing your FEMA denial and it took 9 months, like then you're only getting 9 months of assistance out of FEMA before they have to start packing up. And at some point it's like that makes a little sense because like FEMA has to respond to a lot of different disasters. Um, but you know, it creates a lot of issues when long-term resources are not available to kind of transfer over for folks. So for long-term recovery, we got this CDBG-DR, which if you can say 5 times fast, then you can be a disaster recovery reform advocate. So that stands for Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. Uh, and so that's kind of the only that is the only long-term recovery program out there. But because the program does in this is classic DC, right? So like the program only exists when there's money in the program. When there's not money in the program, then the program doesn't exist. And that means that anytime Congress does put money in the program, HUD has to rewrite all the rules for the program and like start from square one. We have a bill called the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act that would actually make it exist when there's not money allocated for it. That should actually speed up the amount of time it takes to get, or speed up, remove some barriers to getting that kind of assistance to disaster impacted households. Yeah, so for this program, it's actually kind of interesting. It's so 70% of it must benefit low and moderate income households. Love that, right? Um, and it's super flexible, which is good. Because every disaster is a little different. So sometimes you might want more infrastructure repair, or like sometimes you want to be like, okay, well, wash out all these bridges. We got to fix all these bridges. Other times it'll just be housing, and you can do that. But it's very flexible, which is good, but it also can kind of create some issues because I've found that local folks in the local government at the local government level sometimes really like to use these funds on their pet projects and things. If there's like a strip mall that they really wanted to redevelop, they'll be like, "Ooh, I can use this money on that, for the strip mall, for that strip mall problem that we've been having, as opposed to just using it for disaster recovery assistance." Um, yeah, I think I've seen it. I saw one township build an access road to a Home Depot parking lot with this money, which is kind of not, again, kind of not what we're hoping happens with this money. But I think with by permanently authorizing it, I think it gives HUD a little bit more like, I guess, cojones, for lack of a better word, to ensure that these funds are actually reaching the people that need them instead of just, you know, whatever your county assemblyman wants to use it for. So I'll also say there's a lot of public comment period, and so that's the one, two, three, four, five, sixth box on the list. This is the time. This is what HUD has to do in order to get the funds out the door. Which, if this seems like a long and complicated process, again, that is because it is. So there's actually a public comment period that is baked in where they have to listen to groups, individuals providing comment about what HUD is using this money for. I will say, like all public comment periods, like it kind of doesn't work, or might not work in a very good way. Uh, Typically, a state will have already written the plan that they're going to use. They already they already had that written up like way before the public comment period, and they'll just kind of like not take anybody's advice off after that public comment period. So I will say, if you're a state level or doing state level advocacy, you know, kind of the minute Congress passes that disaster aid package, talking with the state government, talking with the community development folks about like what needs to go into the plan can be a little bit more useful than waiting all the way for the public comment period to go. So, yeah, so this is just kind of a grab bag of different horrible things that might happen during long-term recovery. Uh, I'll note that oftentimes short-term housing solutions can become long-term housing solutions. Sometimes at the local and the state level, they'll be providing folks with like travel trailers or something like that, right? Uh, Travel trailers, like living in a travel trailer works for like, 6 months or so, but after a year living in a travel trailer, it can get kind of gross, because you're not meant to live in a travel trailer for that amount of time. And so when there isn't long-term recoveries, you know, housing solutions available, you're kind of stuck living in that, and that can get very bad. I'll also say sometimes at the local level, they might pass like exclusionary laws that prohibit, building new affordable housing or building multifamily housing. That happened a lot in the like outside New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, where they were passing laws that would prevent building any sort of housing that might allow folks relocating from New Orleans to move there. Um, I'll also say, you know, throughout all of this, the folks that are unable to access these resources and unable to get out of town or stay with relatives or find some sort of alternative housing, they're going to be experiencing homelessness. Um, and kind of in the year following a disaster, there's a lot of sympathy for that. But by this point in long-term recovery, that kind of sympathy runs out and folks are just kind of, the encampment sweeps start, I'll say. But I will say that CDBG-DR is a very large source of funding that can be used for rapid rehousing, housing creation. You don't even have to use it to replace. It's not even like you can just build new housing with it. It doesn't even have to be replacing housing that was impacted. So it's a very useful source for that. I'll just say overall, I kind of talked a little bit about categorical eligibility for disaster assistance before. I also wanted to just mention this 4 rights, or how community choice affects disaster recovery, right? Because when we're looking at climate change, they get the word managed retreat uh, gets thrown around very often. Uh, Managed retreat is like, moving away from the coast due to sea level rise or something like that. Uh, and that's kind of a fraught issue, right? Because you're basically telling folks to move, that they can't stay in their own community due to climate change. And that can be very, very difficult and is not a very, it's not a very good way to deal with it in a way that values human rights. So how we view that, when somebody asks me like, oh, well, what's a good recovery? What's a good disaster recovery look like? I say, well, it's the one that conserves the 4 rights, preserves the 4 rights, which is the right to choose. So it's the right to choose to, uh, uh, well, here, let me explain it like this. So it's like the right to stay, the right to leave. Wait, did I do this right? Choose, leave, stay. Right, Megan? Did I mix it up? A right to equal treatment, right? No, it's right. I was doing it right. Sorry, there's like it's like the right to choose, the right to stay, the right to equal treatment, the right to have a say. So it's supposed to rhyme. So but yeah, it's the right to choose whether you're leaving or staying. So if you did want to stay, you could stay in your disaster impacted communities. Um, but it's important that you have that choice, that you're able to make that choice. There's the right to equal treatment so that every member of the community is offered the same opportunities. And then the right to have a say, which is you have the right to direct input into, the decision that your community is making. So I always say, I mean, and this is like a crazy answer, but like, I'm always like, well, if you want to stay, in your town that is rapidly sinking into the ocean, like I think the federal government should pay to ratchet your house 20 feet up in the air. You know, I don't know why you would want to live in a house ratcheted 20 feet up in the air, but if you want to live that way, you know, God damn it, I believe that that we should allow that. So or we should provide assistance to do that. Uh, and so I think kind of that's a good way. And this is also kind of modeled, this also works in with a lot of like international law on, the rights of displaced persons. So, because, I'm sure folks have also heard the word climate refugee thrown around. And so this is also kind of a framework for ensuring that, if your community is facing like catastrophic destruction from due to like rising sea levels or what have you, that your rights are being preserved as a human.
Hey Noah, sorry. This is like really, really good and you're like on a roll, so I don't want to cut you off, but we do have a few minutes left and I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Am I just going? Oh, snap. Man, I'm just going.
It's okay. It's good information and people are giving you kudos in the chat, so it's good.
No, I appreciate that. This is my last slide actually. So we're there. I was gonna say what can tenants do about this? I'd say be prepared. And I'm happy to talk about disaster preparedness anytime, any day. Um, I'll just say I always tell people an organized building is a building that can better withstand disasters. Even just knowing what your neighbors' needs are, provides direct assistance, that helps a lot. Even just knowing like you know, who needs wheelchair access and that sort of thing. And then there's also kind of specific mitigation measures that you can push for your building. Those are things like elevating units above flood areas, usually, keeping the common areas on at the ground level, earthquake retrofits if you're out in California or the Pacific Northwest, debris resistant windows and that sort of thing. So there's a bunch of things that you could do that could very easily kind of integrate in with ongoing kind of demands of your management. So, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
So thank you, Noah. There was like a lot of conversation happening in the chat too, and I know Megan, thank you so much for answering it as they came up. But for folks who are watching this on YouTube after, I just want to make sure that I verbalize like the answers to those questions too. But the first one came from Chandra, and I think this will be a good opportunity for y'all to highlight some of the work that you're going to be doing in the future. But she asked like if there are any statistics on the type of disasters and costs, examples like how many people are affected, what is the cost of flooding and fires, etc. So yeah, if y'all want to share a little bit more about what you're working on for that.
Yeah, I'll say we're working on a series of fact sheets at the state level that'll come out and show how many units are at risk of disaster impacts and like what the level of risk those folks have. And that'll kind of give us a better opportunity to take a look at, what the costs are with that higher risk. And there's a lot of like, I have a lot of data floating around my head about the issue. But there are kind of simple things like, every dollar spent in, resilience work and that's or like hazard mitigation saves $10 in recovery dollars and that sort of thing. But if there's more if you're looking for a specific number, you'll feel free to reach out to us and I'll see if we have it or not. FEMA historically has not been very forthcoming with data, so it's kind of difficult to parse that.
And then Frank, I don't know if you were trying to ask a question, but okay, I'll unmute you for now, but if you want to come back off, just feel free to raise your hand. Okay, and then we had just somebody else asking, if somebody like if there's any water leaking damage to your apartment, would we be able to use like the disaster recovery funds? And Megan, I think if you want to elaborate, you can, but I
Yeah,
guess it depends on like what, yeah.
yeah. I was just gonna say, so to get most of the grant and funding that Noah was describing, you usually have to have be in an area that's gotten a presidentially declared disaster. So that's when, the state asks the federal government, hey, can we get a federally declared disaster? The federal government says yes or no. And with that determination, then you can get FEMA and long-term recovery funding and all that good stuff. So I dropped a link in the chat if you want to check if where you live has received a federally declared presidential disaster. Most times you'll know because the damage has to be pretty intense. But you can feel free to use that link to double check if you're interested.
So thanks, Megan. And I think you also shared some of the work that the West North Carolina Tenants Network is working on too in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
even though they're not no, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say we'll include that link in the follow-up email too, so folks can read it over later.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll say the folks out in Western North Carolina, like obviously it's very, very bad. Um, and you know, I don't blame them for not being here because I'm sure that they are doing something that is 100 times more important and life-saving than being on this call right now, listening to me prattle for 45 minutes. Uh, but I'll say they're, the folks out there are very good. They were already thinking about kind of disasters before this hurricane, so um, it's been very good to see advocates from across that state come together and work with disaster impacted communities.
And I see Chandra has her hand up too, and I think that will be the last question we take, folks. So thank you again.
Wrong button. There we go. Hi. So actually, one of the questions I think that was kind of answered was about the insurance and how well, like I know, like oftentimes with disasters, that's not something that's going to cover, but with fires, like a lot of flooding, and kind of put an example in there. Like my town flooded in 2018, and it was very unexpected. And most people there did not have insurance, but 2 towns over, everybody had insurance for flooding because they were in a floodplain. So I'm kind of curious, like how much disaster, like if there's any like information on like what could have been like covered by insurance if it had been had, whether insurance companies like are, if that's being made more available to people, if it's something that's being looked at, because like they wouldn't cover, or you weren't even offered that as an option if you weren't in a floodplain. So is that something that's happening elsewhere and with other types of disasters? Is that something that's being addressed?
That's a very good question and a rich vein of kind of discussion that I think advocates are having right now. We don't get like super into it just because I think we're going to be getting into it kind of shortly, but historically we have not, just because that has tended to impact more homeowners rather than renters. But I think the issue has gotten so bad that it's kind of impacting everybody at this point. Um, but yeah, that's kind of like that's offered via the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, which is actually run out of FEMA. And it's a government subsidized insurance, and it's government subsidized because of all the flooding it would have to be, or else, because other insurers didn't actually want to insure it because it's, uh, quite a lot of flooding and will only be getting worse in the future. So there are things that you can do that could like lower rates. There's like some community level action, like they'll lower rates for a specific community if, a community, you know, throws in money on a new, green infrastructure, dam or something like that, or does a public awareness campaign or things like that. But it kind of does depend on like community to community. Um, yeah, I mean, and in terms of like you can have NFIP even if you're not in the floodplain. But nine times, I'm not saying that you should not have it if you're not in the floodplain. But I think a lot of homeowners historically have been like, well, I'm not in the floodplain, I'm not going to have flood insurance. And I think to your point, I think we're getting at the to the point now where um FEMA has been trying to update its maps to capture future risk of flooding as opposed to historical risk of flooding. And so I think that's going to be an issue that we're going to continue to see. But I do know in places like extreme South Louisiana is actually they've been pushing back against FEMA updating those maps because for folks in low-lying areas near the coast, it's actually been dry, when they update the maps, that like doubles their rates. So I think folks are trying to figure out a way to kind of manage the risk without forcing certain people to subsidize other folks and that sort of thing. So it's a incredibly complicated process that I'm looking forward to having Meghan look into over the next year and a half.
Oh, thanks, Noah. I would just add on to that, and I'm sure that like you know, I put this in the chat, but like the big takeaway from this presentation is that our disaster recovery system is fundamentally broken and it fails at very specific points. People fall through the crack, and it's usually those with the lowest income and from the most marginalized groups. And it's the same thing with the insurance industry. So the same pitfalls we see in the larger system are the same ones we see in the insurance industry.
Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. I know we've reached the end of the hour, but again, I just want to thank everybody for their time and for their questions. And thank you to Noah and Megan for joining us this month. If y'all can stay on for just like maybe a minute or two extra, you know, my colleague who leads like our Homes Our Votes nonpartisan campaign would probably be really upset if I didn't give some of her work a shout out today because tomorrow's election day. So I do, if y'all haven't voted yet, I do want to share some resources for you to help you out. If you haven't made a plan or if you need help mobilizing other folks, feel free to use like our resource in the chat that I just dropped. If for whatever reason you feel like you're being like, you know, people are using intimidation tactics on you, or if you feel like you're receiving any misinformation, there is an election protection hotline available to y'all. Uber and Lyft are also doing rides or discounts for rides to the polls. If you have Uber, there should be a button that says go vote, and then Lyft will use the code vote24. But there's also a program called Rideshare to Vote, and they're doing rides to like 15, I think 15 or 14 states, I can't remember, 17 states. So I'll drop that in the chat with the list of states that they're providing rides for. And if you click that link that I just dropped in the chat, you can request a ride there. And we also have a, just like a publication that we released earlier this year that kind of talks a little bit more on like why voting matters specifically for tenants. So if you want to read more about that and use it to mobilize folks, feel free to tap into that. But yeah, that's really all I wanted to share with y'all. Again, thank you for being here. And the next Tenant Talk Live will be on December 2nd. And yeah, and then it'll be the end of the year. So thank you again for the wonderful time, and we'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.
Happy voting.
Thanks, everyone.